Good afternoon. My name is Heather Hampson, and I will be presenting Chapter 8 of Allison Terry's book, Clinical Research for the Doctorate of Nursing Practice. This chapter will give an overview of the selection and utilization of a mixed research design. So just as a reminder, research design is how a researcher chooses to answer their research question. A researcher must first know what type of question they are asking before they can even select a research design. For example, are we asking a "what is happening" type question or a "why is this happening" type of question? Once the researcher has an understanding of the type of question, they can then begin to build their research design. This will be the foundations of how they gather and then interpret and analyze their data. So today we will be reviewing one type of research design called the mixed method research design. Here are a few of the objectives for this presentation. The participants should be able to understand the idea of a mixed research design. They should understand why a researcher would choose a mixed research design over another design. They should understand the advantages and limitations of utilizing a mixed research design. They should understand the different types of mixed research design. And finally, they should understand how to use a mixed research design. A mixed research design is exactly what it sounds like. It is the combination of two different research design elements into one. When a researcher chooses a mixed research design, they are in fact combining the best parts of both the qualitative research design and the quantitative research design. So next we'll look at these individual research designs to get a better understanding of why a researcher would want to combine them. One of the most important aspects of utilizing a mixed research design method is to understand the individual components of the qualitative design method and the quantitative design method. So here we're going to do a little bit of a review of Terry's Chapter 7, Designing a Clinically Based Qualitative Capstone Research Project, so that we can understand why a researcher would want to utilize this along with the quantitative. So in the qualitative method, you have to remember that qualitative usually will have a smaller but much more in-depth look at a topic potentially being studied. The hypothesis is usually generated from the research that is gathered. The researcher has to be able to initiate themselves into the lives they are studying. They must be able to create a working relationship with those participants. There's always the possibility of the researcher maybe becoming emotionally connected to the research subjects. And qualitative studies must ensure that the research being conducted does not disrupt the individual's lives. So in that qualitative component from Chapter 7, you really can see again that the hypothesis is generated from the data that we gather. And the concern really is with human responses and perceptions. How does that affect the participants? Data is typically collected from a primary source, and that's usually the researcher themselves. So they may be doing field work or observation work, and usually this research and the questions are geared at why or how. So an example is, how does culture affect a new parent's choice between using commercially prepared diapers or maybe cloth diapers? So now we can move on to quantitative. So this is a little bit of a review from Terry's Chapter 6, Designing a Clinically Based Quantitative Capstone Research Project. So here, the design can be very specific in nature. We're looking at individuals, groups, or even larger populations. Typically, these studies are much larger in numbers, but they're more generalized in nature. We can do either an observational or maybe an experimental study. This type of study can eliminate the concern for the emotional connections to individuals that we likely find in the qualitative study, but then the quantitative studies will need to ensure that concerns such as bias and validity are then kept in check. Usually with our quantitative research designs, we are attempting to find a correlation or that causal relationship. Statistical analysis, data statistics is significantly the focus. Data collection can be done in cross-sectional surveys, longitudinal studies, case-control studies, experimental studies, and here the research design really is looking at the what is happening. So an example I have here is what happens when a female patient is given hormone replacement after childbirth. So that brings us to a mixed research design. And this really does combine qualitative and quantitative. That's the why and the what. So many times a researcher may have a question that cannot simply be answered with a data set or by observations. So by combining qualitative and quantitative, you can start to answer the why and what of a research question. An example could be that a researcher may gather data in a quantitative method, but use a qualitative method for the analysis of the data. Terry, 2018, discusses the idea of compatibility thesis, which is the thought that quantitative and qualitative designs can actually complement each other and in turn create a much more well-rounded picture of the research question being asked. Another concept that Terry 2018 discusses is that of pragmatism, which is the idea that researchers really should use any and all types of research designs that meet the needs of the research question. And utilizing these different designs and utilizing their strengths will actually help minimize the weaknesses. And so in the end, you have a much stronger answer to your research question. So there are some real advantages to utilizing the mixed method research. The first one is that you're actually able to add meaning to data sets. So instead of just numbers, you can utilize pictures and charts and narratives and examples. And this is what helps build that more well-rounded answer to your research question. You can also, in your qualitative research, start looking at larger groups. Larger groups can then be studied. You may have more credibility, or your credibility may increase with a combined study. So think of it as the sum is greater than the two parts. So just because you had a quantitative study or a qualitative study, if you add those two together, again, it gives you this much better picture, more well-rounded picture of the question that you are researching. There is the possibility that you'll have a greater increase in statistical significance. More advantages to utilizing the mixed method research. You can generate numeric data that will go along hand in hand with your qualitative data. You may be able to show a cause and effect. Maybe you're studying smaller groups, but in greater detail and in greater depth. And maybe you're trying to describe a very complex phenomena and you need both the quantitative and the qualitative aspects to get that picture. Finally, the last few advantages to utilizing a mixed method research is you may be utilizing this to test a grounded theory. You may use it to answer much more complex research questions. The strengths of the second research design can then again, like I said before, minimize the first design's weaknesses so they can layer on top of each other. There might be evidence for research conclusions, and it also increases the generalizability of the research. So with every research design, there are advantages and there are limitations. So with the mixed method research, there are a few limitations that we should discuss. The first one is that the acquisition of data may require multiple researchers. So in the previous slide, I talked about the sum equaling more than the two parts. So if you think about doing one design, quantitative design, and the amount of data that you would have to collect for that, and then add on top of that a whole nother research design of qualitative data, you have twice as much amount of data. And then during the analysis portion, it's going to be more than just 1 + 1 = 2. It's going to be a large amount of data that will need to be gone through and analyzed. So it might be more than what one researcher is able to do. So a team of researchers might be feasible. Another limitation is that you might have this greater understanding of both independent research designs are required. So you might have a really good understanding of how to create a quantitative design, but you would really need to understand all the components of both the quantitative and the qualitative designs in order to layer those on top of each other and to utilize them in a mixed method research. Accurate analysis of conflicting data. That's a big one as well. So you're going to have to decide before you start your research on what you're going to do with data that does not correlate to each other in either the quantitative or the qualitative. And then finally, you definitely are going to have to think about the increased need for resources, and that's time. So whether you do the two quantitative and qualitative concurrently, or if you do them sequentially, the amount of time that it will take to analyze the data and complete the data. Funding, it might be an issue, and then just the number of resources or researchers on your team might be needed to be adjusted as well. Okay, so now we're moving into being able to actually utilize a mixed method research. So the first thing a researcher must do is have a really firm idea of what their research question is truly asking. Then they must decide what type of research design will best utilize at reaching the answer in the most conclusive manner. The researcher must weigh the advantages versus those potential limitations and take into account resources available. During this decisional process, a researcher may choose a mixed research design in an attempt to improve the study's validity. This is actually called triangulation, and we're going to talk about triangulation a little bit further in the presentation. Just know that a researcher may use a mixed research design in order to maybe make a corroboration with the data sets. Another reason a researcher may choose a mixed research design is called complementary. This is the idea that through the qualitative and quantitative approach, the researcher will get a much more well-rounded idea of answering their question, and maybe the data will have greater depth to it with both that qualitative and quantitative elements. And if it's used correctly, will sometimes increase the validity of the research. So now that we move into selecting a mixed research approach, there are two components. There's the mixed model research and there's the mixed method research design. And we're going to talk about those a little bit more in the next two slides. So let's look at the mixed model research first. This research design occurs when both qualitative and quantitative data are originally mixed together. Those approaches are mixed together in the original process of the research or across the different stages through the research process. And there are 6 ways to maybe complete this data collection when it's in those different stages for the mixed model research. So what you have to think of is in like question number or example number 1. You have qualitative research objectives or questions, and that leads the researcher to design maybe a qualitative collection of data. but then maybe that data initiates the researcher to perform a quantitative analysis of the data. So then in example 2, again, you have qualitative questions. However, the research decides to create a quantitative data collection component. And then the researcher then, in the analysis portion, does it in a qualitative manner. So as we go through all of these, you can see how slightly different components of how the research is driven through the question or through the process of the collection versus the process of an analysis. So like example 3, again, you can have a qualitative question, research question. The researcher may have developed a quantitative way to collect the data and then maybe look at it and analyze it in a quantitative analysis component as well. Example 4, a quantitative question that the researcher designed a qualitative component to achieve the data and then actually analyzed it in a qualitative component. Example 5, a quantitative question, okay, leading to a qualitative data collection with a quantitative analysis. And finally 6, a quantitative research question that the researcher created a quantitative data collection, however, is going to be now analyzed in a qualitative manner. Okay, so now that a researcher has decided to use a mixed research design and they've chosen either the mixed model research or the mixed method research, the next step is selecting the very specific types of mixed research design out there. So there are 4 types of mixed research design: triangulation, embedded, explanatory, and exploratory. So when a researcher is deciding between the different ones, there are some very key elements that must be addressed. The first is what type of research question is being asked. Again, we've said that several times. But does it need qualitative data, quantitative data, or both? Does it need a qualitative analysis, a quantitative analysis, or both? So you can see when we went back to that mixed model research that you can be very selective in the way that you choose your mixed research design. So once we've decided that, the researcher must also think about a few other things such as timing, weight, and mixing. So in timing constraints, the research studies is a very important factor to consider. A concurrent data collection of both the qualitative and quantitative will occur together. This allows the researcher to gather a large amount of data in one phase of research, where in sequential timing research, that has 2 very distinct phases of data collection. And usually the second phase is dependent on the first data collection phase. Okay. The next thing to think about is weighting. And this is where the researcher applies the gravity to the data collection. So does the quality and quantity data have equal importance, or does one simply support the other to help explain the original data analysis? And finally is the concept of mixing, and that's just how will the 2 data sets be combined? When will they be combined? Is it together all in one? Is it where we're going to embed one into the other? Is one just being used again as supportive? All of those things have to be considered when selecting your type, your very specific type of a mixed research design. So here we're back at triangulation, and I want you to picture the blue triangle on the slide. You can see at the top we have 2 points converging to a 3rd point at the bottom. So this is kind of the idea behind triangulation. You are collecting data in multiple ways and it converges together to be analyzed as one data point. So with triangulation, there are some variations, so called convergence or data transformation or validation of quantitative data or multi-level. In triangulation, the timing of the data collection, it's done at the same time. So both the quantitative and the qualitative data are gathered at the same time. Under weight, they are both given equal weight. So just like that blue triangle on the screen, you can see if I had weighted one side or the other side heavier, it would tip the triangle. But in triangulation, they are given the same weight. And then mixing, the data is mixed during analysis. It's all put in together and you have one large analysis of all the data points together. Now, triangulation does have some limitations. The researcher must decide prior to data collection how any discrepancies in the data are going to be dealt with. And sometimes there are discrepancies between the qualitative and the quantitative components. Also, with the possibility of twice as much data, the researcher must understand that the amount of time and resources needed to effectively complete and analyze the research data. And that could play a role into selecting a triangulation as a potential mixed research design. And so here I have a quick example of triangulation. So you need to drive to a nursing conference. So you check Google Maps and you check Garmin GPS for the best routes. That's going to give you quantitative data. You also decide to ask your coworker and of course your mother, because they're always right, about what they feel is the best route. So that's going to give you your qualitative. So why is this a better route than the other? You're going to merge all that data together to pick the best solution. Next, we have the embedded specific mixed research design. So in an embedded design, the researcher will use either a quantitative design or a qualitative element or vice versa. The second data set is meant to just support the original data set. And so the original data will have a little bit more weighted to it. So variations of embedded can be called embedded experimental or embedded correlational. The timing, both the quantitative and qualitative data gathered are done either at the same time or then one after the other. The weight, again, usually one type is weighted heavier, but it just depends on how the research design was set up. And then mixing, one type of data is just slipped in or given a little component in the larger set of data. So it's just meant to be supportive in nature. So embedded can be used when the researcher is maybe asking two different questions, or when using one type of data, but it will not be enough to answer the research question thoroughly. So one benefit is that since there's two data sets and one is embedded in the other, they can actually remain as separate components or separate sets of data. The data can be collected at the same time, or again, before or one right after another. And embedding may help to describe why a specific outcome might have occurred. So my example for an embedded mixed research design would be to be able to describe how a patient group is impacted after receiving X treatment. So you might be looking at what happens to patients when they receive X treatment as a quantitative component, but you really want to describe how it affects the patient and maybe their lives as well. And so that's that qualitative component that we can add in there for a more well-rounded research. So now let's look at exploratory design. There are some variations on exploratory, so it can be called follow-up expectations or participant selection. In the explanatory design, one of the unique things is that it has two separate phases. So typically the quantitative data is collected first and then is analyzed. And it's typically considered the priority data set. That's the data that you really were trying to get. And then potentially a qualitative data collection may occur. So if doing follow-up design, the researcher typically completed the quantitative data and then upon analysis needed maybe to explain the results. So then a qualitative data design would occur in an attempt to gather very specific information. Researchers with a smaller team may utilize the explanatory design since the two data components are gathered one after the other. and the qualitative design will typically be determined by the original quantitative result. So it might be that the qualitative might be a smaller as the secondary phase goes through. But this type of design will take a prolonged amount of time in the data collection process and then analysis. So one of the limitations here again is resources and time. So under timing, first typically is quantitative and then the qualitative will occur. Weight, again, typically quantitative is more weighted more than the qualitative. And the mixing, the data connection occurs between the two phases. So after you've gotten one and analyzed it, then we would mix the components together. So my example of an explanatory mixing research design might be a nursing instructor is reviewing the score from her respiratory exam. The score itself, the score of all the tests, would be the quantitative data. But upon analysis, she is just one student who has scored 30 points lower than everyone else on the exam. So the nursing instructor then contacts that student to try to identify why the student received such a low score. And so then that nursing instructor is attempting to understand that outlier of that original data collection and is looking at maybe some of the qualitative components in that. And finally, the last specific version of mixed research design is exploratory. So it's actually just kind of the opposite of explanatory. So in the exploratory design, you have a few variations such as instrumental development or taxonomy development. Again, exploratory has two phases, but in the exploratory, the research design is originally qualitative in nature, and the data collection of that qualitative manner is collected first. Then after analysis of the qualitative data, the researcher may need to have more supportive data and need to complete a secondary data set that is then quantitative in design. So when completing maybe an instrument development, the original research may be a very small group. It will be utilized in a qualitative approach to maybe serve as a pilot study. And then the data will be then utilized to create maybe a quantitative component such as designing an instrument. This is great for a researcher who might not have an instrument created or when maybe variables are not clear. And then when maybe utilizing a taxonomy development in exploratory, this is where the researcher has completed their qualitative data and then upon analysis determines there's a need to maybe classify or detail the data in a quantitative manner. So things to think of in both the exploratory design, the qualitative data is considered the main data source and the quantitative would just be the supportive data in nature. So again, looking through timing, qualitative first, then quantitative. The weight, again, is typically in the qualitative component. And mixing, again, data connection, the data connection occurs between the two phases. So for my example in the exploratory mixed research design is upon completion of a nursing conference, a survey was conducted asking participants to describe how the courses might affect their job satisfaction. After reviewing the results and doing your data analysis, the researchers then wanted to know maybe what types of positions the participants are currently employed in. So that would be their quantitative component that would just kind of support some of their original qualitative data analysis. In conclusion, research design is the foundation to how a researcher will answer their research question. The importance of selecting the appropriate design is imperative to gaining valid and reliable data. Researchers who choose to utilize a mixed method research design will gain the strengths of both the qualitative and quantitative measures, creating a well-rounded and supported research data. Researchers must also take into consideration resources before attempting to conduct a mixed method research design, since many will need large research teams, times, and expenses to conduct. This concludes the overview of Terry 2018 Chapter 8, Designing a Clinically Based Mixed Method Research Project. Thank you for your participation.